Have you ever wondered, you put your kid to bed at night and he's crying, or your daughter's complaining that she wants the light on? Is this something to be concerned about, or is this just normal kids going to bed? Or it might have to do with going to school in the morning, right? Do you have to drag your child to the bus stop? So what's going on? Is there an anxiety going on over there? Is there something that we need to address? Is this normal developmental behavior for your child? These are the questions. These are the burning questions that we have today, and we're going to unpack together. My name is Daniel Ifra, LCSW, here at the SaneStroming Podcast, where we will not be brainstorming, but we will be sane-storming ways to keep each other sane in this complex world. So today we're talking about the anxious child. Now, before we get into the anxious child, let's have a broad word here about anxiety. And you're going to hear a lot of different stuff about anxiety. I mean, it's one of those topics that are sort of like, there's everything about it, but it's also really, really hard to sift through what's really worthwhile. So the thing is about anxiety is, in a nutshell, this is completely a nutshell, by the way, because then we can just destroy all the books on anxiety in this nutshell. The nutshell is that anxiety basically is running away from the fear is what anxiety is all about. So what'll happen is, if a person has an anxiety, let's say fear of the dark, let's just talk about a very simple one, right? Fear of the dark, that means the person's going to be running away from the dark. Person has a fear of going outside, agoraphobia, then that means that the person's going to avoid going outside. So that, in a sense, is what anxiety is. And anxiety is that overwhelming feeling, overwhelming fear of something, and then as a result of that, responding by trying to avoid that thing. That's really what anxiety, when we talk about anxiety in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about. Now, here is a little bit different because we're talking about the anxious child. The anxious child is, obviously, we're talking about anxiety, but we're also talking about the profile of a child that's anxious, which happens to be different than a lot of the things we see with adults when it comes to anxiety. Let's talk about, for a minute, let's just drop the word anxiety. Let's talk about kids in general. There's a very distinct difference between children and adults, obviously, but there's ones that are very specific, especially when it comes to anxiety. What we need to remember is that kids, in a general sense, nothing here is absolute, but in general terms, kids are conformists. Kids are subordinate. Kids follow instructions because they recognize, at least generally, they recognize that they're not the one in charge. And therefore, they have to go along with certain things, like it or not. Now, all of us are going to say, what do you mean? My kid doesn't do that. My kid doesn't go along with my things. And then it's true. I get it. I know that. But if you think about it, at their core, kids are expected more or less to go along with things. And most of them do most of the time. We just take the time that they go along with things for granted because we assume that they're supposed to be, because they are supposed to be, because they're kids, right? So we have this interesting twist to kids, that kids are not always in control. Kids can't just do what they want to do. So let's go back to the anxiety piece. Anxiety, we said, is having a fear of something and then avoiding it, right? Well, what happens if you're a child and you have a fear of something and then you avoid that? It can look like a couple different things. It can look like, I have this fear of something and therefore I'm not doing it, right? Which is sort of how it is with an adult. And that can certainly happen with children. But there's another aspect as well, that because children don't get that liberty per se, and it might actually be a blessing in disguise, but because kids don't always have that liberty to be able to say, I'm not doing it, or to be able to avoid, so they conform anyway, what happens is their anxiety is somewhat suppressed, if you will. And therefore, the avoidance that you will see with adults isn't necessarily as clear as it is with the kids, because the kids, again, are wired to go along with everything. So what you might end up seeing instead of just that plain avoidance is a lot of behavioral kind of stuff. You might end up seeing some irritability, or you might end up seeing some tantrums or spurts of anger, right? And all those things might be related to anxiety, but you're not seeing necessarily them avoid outright. So with kids, a little trickier because you really have to delve into what's going on inside their head, what's going inside of their bodies, in terms of the sensations of where it feels to be anxious, what anxiety means for them. So it's a lot more complex, anxiety with kids, and it doesn't necessarily always present like anxiety with adults do. So, but today we're talking about anxiety with kids. So we have this kind of interesting narrowed anxiety which is in children. Now, children is a very broad term. Okay. Children is very broad, you see. There's different developmental stages kids have. You have your crawling stage, you have your exploring stage, you have your independence. I mean, depending which psychologist you're going with, founder of psychology, the stages vary and the stages are, differ. But the reality is everyone's going to agree that different stages of growing up has a different flavor to it. So anxiety in one stage is going to look very different than an anxiety in another stage. And so as much as we're talking about anxiety with kids, we really have to narrow down the developmental stage that they're in to understand anxiety within that developmental stage. And that leads us to the next piece. And the next piece is that, remember, kids are developing. Because kids and children are developing, they didn't reach, right? That the suit that we wear, that we purchase today, that suit is more or less going to fit us. I mean, that is at least lengthwise. That suit is going to fit us for the end of days because we finished growing, right? But kids didn't finish growing. So what fits them at 2 years old is not going to fit them at 5 years old, or even 2.5 years old, actually. I mean, just check out the credit card bill, right? So kids are constantly changing, and it's not only in their physical appearance, it's also in what's going on inside of them developmentally and emotionally. So what you'll see sometimes is that kids will be anxious and worried and nervous and insecure about certain things. But you know what? It's completely appropriate for their developmental stage. So if you have, let's just say for argument's sake, a 2.5-year-old that's asking you to put on a nightlight, that's completely appropriate. That doesn't mean your child has anxiety. It doesn't. Yes, your child has anxiety, but it's not an anxious child. It's a child being anxious. And there's a distinction there. So that's the first thing when trying to at least assess if your child is anxious or has anxiety. You got to try to figure out where's the her or his developmental stage, where it's up to, and is this appropriate behavior for that developmental stage? It sounds kind of simple, but it's not, because you have these gray areas that sort of cross over that, yeah, they were scared of the dark and they needed their teddy, but now it became sort of like he won't go anywhere without his teddy, right? So there's, everything has a lot of different layers to it. But again, today's podcast is about the anxious child and giving you guys a flavor of what that can look like, and what to look out for, and what some takeaways are in terms of where to go from there. So determining if it's developmental and being able to identify where their developmental stage is as it relates to the anxiety is extremely important. If in fact we do say, hey, this child definitely has anxiety. For this developmental stage, this is over the charts. This is beyond. Does that mean we do anything about it? And what is it that we do? So whenever we're talking about a diagnosis, we have to keep something in mind. We all tend to be anxious at certain times, right? It's just part of life. We're stressed out. We're anxiety. We're anxious. We're feeling down. Does that mean because I'm feeling down that I'm depressed and I have depression? No, obviously not. We're all human, and this is how humans work. This is how we're made to work, right? We are not robots that are that can't deviate. We are feeling beings, and those feelings go up and down. Same thing with kids. Kids are no different in that way. When you're trying to figure out if the anxiety is something that needs to be addressed, the number one question has to be, is you got to assess if this anxiety is getting in the way of their daily functioning. And how much is it taking over their life? Or how much is it taking over your life, for that matter, right? Again, with kids, it's going to be different than it's going to be with adults, because kids might still be going through the movements. They might still be going to school in the morning, but they might be a wreck going to school in the morning. They might be super irritable and super resistant and defiant. And what's really happening there is the anxiety. So that assessing if it's getting in the way is not going to be as clear cut as it's going to be with an adult. Adults, you can just say, you can ask them, are you avoiding stuff? You're not doing X, Y, Z. Why not? Right? With kids, it's not going to work that way for a number of reasons. Reasons being because they might still be doing it. Number two, it could be what appears to be for them to what seems like anxiety might only be as a result of certain symptoms that are not initially apparent that they're anxiety. Again, there's the irritability piece, there's avoidance piece of the whole behavior. It might be withdrawal, all that kind of stuff that's not clearly them avoiding one specific fear. So that's another piece of anxiety when we're trying to determine if we need to do anything. So you can have a kid that is behaviorally challenging. You can have a child that appears to be very sad, withdrawn, irritable, right? And all that can actually be chalked up to an inner anxiety, and you just don't know about it. So this is kind of the complexities of anxiety with children. Now, at the same time, I want to make sure to take a note. This can be very confusing, because what happens is, because of this phenomena of the way anxiety presents with kids, you'll have people, basically anything that is like, let's say, off the beaten path with their children, oh, he's just a really anxious kid. And that may or may not be true, right? You may completely be overdiagnosing, you may be misdiagnosing, there may be something else that's more responsible than anxiety, right? So it can be tricky getting to that root of the cause of their behaviors, because remember, with kids, a lot of the way you're assessing is going to be based upon their symptomology of their affect, their mood, their behaviors. And once you're going down that road, there's so many other possibilities there. So sometimes we assume they're anxious. Many times they assume, well, they're like us, and I know I'm anxious about it, so they must be anxious too, right? And it's not always the case. Sometimes it's underdiagnosed, underrecognized. And the reason it's underrecognized is because, well, I don't see him being anxious. He's doing what he has to do. He's just miserable, right? So you have this sort of like dichotomy in the way anxiety sort of presents itself, which can be confusing. The next thing that I wanted to just talk briefly about is, once we do establish that there's an anxious process going on with your kid, there is a number of things that we have to look out for. And the first thing is we got to recognize is that we don't want to pathologize their anxiety. If you're going to pathologize their anxiety, what do I mean by pathologize? Oh, I'm so sorry. He must be suffering so terribly, and and because of that, he can't do this and he can't do that. And you know what? I'll go get it for you, or I'll do this for you. Really, it's a very, very slippery slope, because we're all here to protect our kids, and especially today's day and age with all the validation talk. And I'm a big proponent of validation. Don't get me wrong, but that can very easily cross over to dangerous waters as actually feeding the anxiety. And I'll tell you why. You see, the anxiety, the whole concept, remember how we started off. Anxiety means avoidance. The more you avoid, and this is a basic concept, no matter how you slice it, this is what's going to happen with anxiety. The more you avoid, the more anxious you're going to become. The more you're going to stand up and not avoid and face it, the more the anxiety is going to calm down. That's what it is in a nutshell. I know it's oversimplified, but that's the core principle. Now, when that's the case, if you're going to over-validate and over-comfort and coddle certain anxieties, so what you're going to do, what you're essentially doing is you're giving power to the anxiety. You're conditioning your child that, yes, when you feel this way, don't do this and don't do that. On the flip side, the last thing I want you guys to do is to walk away from this podcast and say, well, he said that you just have to tell them they need to do this and see it through and not give into it, because that would be a tragic mistake as well. Forcing it through just because he's anxious or just because she's anxious is not either the way to go, because what you're doing is you're completely dismissing the fact that the child is anxious. You're completely, I mean, you can actually traumatize a kid that way. So by pushing their anxiety through. So you need to sort of have this balance, and it's a very, very fine balance. And I think that which warrants a whole podcast in of itself. But what you need to do is, at least the equation is, you need to validate that you get it, you understand it, but the way we're going to deal with it is a systematic, not completely enveloping ourselves with it. We need to fight it. We need to beat it on some level. And so you have that sort of that balance that needs to work together. You can't coddle it and you can't just man up, because neither of those ways are going to be effective. They're actually going to backfire and they're going to be destructive. So this is very, very important. So just to summarize, we're talking about the anxious child. Lots and lots to talk about here. But the anxious child is a very different presentation than the anxious adult. So we need to understand the context of the anxious child. We need to check their developmental stages, see what's normal, see what's within normal range rather, and what's not for that particular developmental stage. We need to, once we say, hey, this is not typical for this developmental stage, is it something that warrants a response? Do I need to work with it? Do I need to deal with it? Well, let's see how much it's getting in the way. How much is it impairing their function? What does function impairment look like with kids? It doesn't have to be a full-blown avoidance. Function impairment could be behavioral issues. It could be sadness. It could be bedwetting at night. I mean, all these things can be symptoms of an anxious process that they're not actually verbalizing and they're not even acting upon, because, again, they're trying to conform and sort of do what a good kid is supposed to be. And by the way, a lot of people with anxiety are very, very good-natured people that want to do the right thing. So you might have your child trudging through and he's depleted, or she might just be absolutely like over the top. So this is very, very important. You want to check out how much is it getting in the way? What is it? And then you need to make sure that we have a validation piece along with a conceptualization that this anxiety is not something that we want to just sort of like coddle and pathologize, that they're not well, or they can't handle it. We need to be sensitive to the fact that promoting or giving too much credence to anxiety as a whole can actually be very destructive. At the same time, we got to be careful not to be dismissive. So we need these two things to come together. And you know what? In future podcasts, we're going to have a lot to talk about, whether it's anxiety with kids, anxiety with adults, how to respond to it, how to recognize it, how to assess for it, how to respond for it, and keep that balance between validation, yet behaviorally moving things along, moving things forward, and facing the fear anyways. We're going to talk tons about that. But today was, I think, just a very important overall view of the anxious child. That's what we came for, and I hope that this was helpful.